lukewarm. Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. And in this video, I'll be attempting to circumvent the culture war, this time by rethinking the critical theory of Georg Lukacs and Ernst Bloch by way of David Swift's book, A Left for Itself. But before we get to Lukacs, let's consider the right-wing critical theory of Dinesh D'Souza.
I think what's interesting with gay marriage is we've actually seen a sea change of American public opinion on this topic. And I want to use this to highlight something that's very important. This sea change has not come out of politics. The left has been fighting a culture war outside of politics, and it's been the only side fighting. And what the left has done, I think, much more shrewdly and farsightedly, is occupy the high ground of academia, the media, Hollywood, Broadway, the whole world of music and comedy. I call these the megaphones of our culture. And so the gay marriage debate, in a way, began when Ellen came out of the closet. Will and Grace, 400 sitcoms. So the weird thing for Republicans is that when they were like, what happened to gay marriage? What happened is that one side was fighting, and by the time the issue even got to politics, it was a fait accompli. The cultural shift that is outside of politics but affects politics had already occurred. So that's my take on gay marriage. It's kind of an interesting lesson of how politics is dependent on culture. And Republicans long term don't just have to win in politics, they also have to establish a foothold in the culture.
D'Souza is, of course, obliquely referring to the usual right-wing conspiracy theory about what Jordan Peterson would call neo-Marxism and what more conscious anti-Semites would call cultural Marxism. That is, he's not merely alluding to the idea that Marxists launched a cultural offensive against Western civilization, but also picking up the tactic of culture war himself. If politics is downstream from culture, as the devious Frankfurt School philosophers thought, then the upholders of traditional American values must fight to either hold on to or recreate their own culture. But what exactly is D'Souza talking about when he talks of culture? To say that politics is downstream from culture is to say that people act out their beliefs, attitudes, and ideas, and that they are given these beliefs, attitudes, and ideas by something called culture. While culture can be used as an umbrella term that includes laws, religious beliefs, political structures, and economic systems, in the context that Dinesh D'Souza is using the term, the word means something more particular than that. I think that cultural power is distinct from political, economic, and legal power in so much as cultural products are expressions of subjective understanding. That means that the realm of culture is epistemic, but it also means that culture is not merely a body of knowledge. Our culture is not just a list of supposed facts that we hold to be true, but it could be thought of as a list of facts and the methodology of list-making. Our culture then would be the practice that creates an interpretive framework that mediates our conscious experience. More than a collection of songs, stories, and rituals, it is the framework that gives those songs or stories significance, and that gives significance to our daily experience as well. Given that culture is the way we interpret the world and thereby create knowledge and meaning, the way to judge a culture is to consider whether the culture in question helps us to apprehend and understand the truth, or what really is. But this sets up a paradox, as what we consider or think that we know to be true is, in the end, always a product of our culture. One solution to this paradox is dogmatism. For example, we can simply assert the truth of a given set of principles and then judge a culture or cultural expression in relationship to those usually fairly simple ideas. Another way of judging a culture would be to judge it not in terms of how well it adheres to a set of moral principles, but rather to judge it based on how productive the culture is, or in terms of whether the culture expands the power of our understanding. To judge a culture based on this criteria would be to judge it in the same way that Faust judges Mephistopheles.
As a guide to higher truths, I really cannot recommend you. And yet, says my contract, signed in blood, you still remain constrained to serve me. Serve me then.
Even an ascete such as the late Harold Bloom, who championed reading the Western canon not on the basis of perpetuating a certain defined outlook or value system, but because the canon was valuable in itself, still understood what was best in our Western culture in terms of the development of an empowered consciousness.
What would Professor Bloom say they'll get by reading Shakespeare and Chaucer?
Oh, I can go on. I can go on.
I know
for
that's
some time
for the rest
on
of
this.
the evening, but I've got 15 minutes.
I know of that, sir. Well, in the first place, I would say cognitive power. That is to say, an increase in one's own ability to think and one's own ability to talk on the basis of that thinking. And the next would be rhetorical power, the ability to understand better the uses of metaphor, which according to Aristotle was the special mark of genius in every one of us. But beyond all that, a real capacity for apprehending otherness.
To return to the topic of the culture war, let us consider what is at stake. Both sides believe that a known value, whether the value is a set of traditional moral principles or the more abstract value of power or the power of understanding, needs to be brought into existence or lived out in society. Dinesh D'Souza and his ilk blame Hollywood and other purveyors of immorality for the failure to realize the true, best principles, while Bloom thought that the enemies of deep culture, of developed understanding, were those who promoted shallow writing, those who were cheerleaders of simple-mindedness, whether on the left or the right. Marx's critics of culture, including Marx himself, thought that the culprit was not to be found in our cultural expressions at all, but rather in the domain of our productive activities. It was not our culture as an expression of knowledge that was at fault for the hollowing out and or the misery of life, but rather the more concrete process of survival, the social relations or culture that set the terms of that survival through work, that was at fault, or that was the cause of our more and more mystified and perhaps one-dimensional understanding. By a Marxist account, it may still be that politics is downstream from culture, but at the same time, culture is downstream from the culture of material production, or from what we'd call economics. This puts Marxists in a bit of a bind, as the culture or consciousness of men and women living under the rule of capitalist economics can be seen to be false. That is, while people believe that they are acting out of their own desires and values, they are instead being driven by, mediated by, economic forces. For Marxists, then, the point of cultural criticism isn't to search out capitalist norms and attitudes in order to stamp them out and replace them with socialist norms and attitudes, as this would have little to no effect, but rather to discover what forms of culture most help the working class get their hands on the real motor of history. That is, the aim is to expand our understanding beyond philosophy, beyond the mind, and into the world. For the Hungarian Marxist Lukacs, a proper working class culture would be one that helped the workers understand how they had been transformed into mere objects in a system outside their control, so as to bring that system to heel. A working class culture would be one that helped workers realize their real interests, or that helped them develop class consciousness. But what is class consciousness? According to Marx in The Poverty of Philosophy, class consciousness arises out of capitalism itself. Quote, large-scale industry concentrates in one place a crowd of people unknown to one another. Competition divides their interests, but the maintenance of wages, this common interest which they have against their boss, unites them in a common thought of resistance. Economic conditions had first transformed the mass of the people into workers. The combination of capital has created for this mass a common situation, common interests. This mass is thus already a class as against capital, but not yet a class for itself. End quote. What does this mean to say that class consciousness exists as something in itself, as it is something opposed to capital, but that class consciousness does not exist as something in and for itself? Well, this is a Hegelian conception. According to Hegel, something is in itself when it is differentiated as against something else. That is, a given object, for instance a pencil, can be said to be merely in itself when it is an object for someone else, say a writer. Something is in itself when it is an object for a subject. The working class is a thing in itself when it is considered as an object for the capitalist class. The working class becomes a thing for itself when it begins to see itself in relationship to capital, to differentiate itself from the capitalist. The working class becomes political when it begins to make demands of the capitalist. However, for the working class to be both in itself and for itself, it would have to become an object for itself, to recognize itself as a subject, and in that instance overcome its being for capitalists or capitalism. According to Marx, the working class can only become a thing for and in itself through self-abolition and through the abolition of all class relations. Now, the aim of a literary critic like Lukacs, then, is to discover what forms of cultural expression assist the working class in the development of a consciousness that can take itself up as an object and transform that object so as to become a new subject. And Lukacs' essay, Realism in the Balance, is a prime example of how the question of working class consciousness can be transformed into a kind of culture war. In his essay, Lukacs criticizes Expressionism, a term that includes artistic movements ranging from naturalism to surrealism for Lukacs, as literary genres that flatten reality to the level of appearance, and that thereby lead readers to, quote, confine themselves to reproducing whatever manifests itself immediately and on the surface of society. For Lukacs, the 19th century realist novels of Thomas Mann and Maxim Gorky invite readers to consider their social world as a unity and in its totality, rather than to be overwhelmed by a fragmented montage of disconnected experiences that arise within a stream of consciousness story or a surrealist dream poem. What I would note is that Lukacs' argument against Expressionism and for Socialist Realism, an argument primarily with the German Marxist Ernst Bloch, took place at a time when political battles within the Third International and the Soviet Union were raging. The Comintern abandoned the communist struggle against social democratic parties and opted instead to create a popular front against fascism, even as Stalin consolidated his power in the Soviet Union by instigating show trials to eliminate enemies and bring the rest of the Politburo to heel. And both Bloch and Lukacs saw their position as confirming the political decisions that had already been made. In the introduction to the book Aesthetics and Politics, the book wherein Bloch and Lukacs' essays on Expressionism and Socialist Realism were collected and published in 1980, the editor Ronald Taylor notes that both Bloch and Lukacs' arguments were deformed by the political circumstances that defined their moment. Taylor notes that Lukacs' officious tone was symptomatic of the administrative tone of official culture within the Comintern during the Popular Front period, while he notes that Bloch was providing, quote, fulsome affidavits for the Moscow trials, complete with official tales of Nazi Japanese plots and the Bolshevik Party, at the very moment that he was defending Expressionism. Given my own moment, my own inclination to strike a blow against the culture war that's dominating our politics, it would be easy to just decide that this debate about social realism and expressionism reflected the impasse that was actually going on politically at that moment within socialism. But to do that would also be to dismiss the question of whether or not politics are downstream from culture. However, the theoretical problem can't be set aside so easily. The question still remains, how does one find a truly critical stance within a culture that is defined by the contradictions of capitalist modernity? How does one create an intentional revolutionary politics that won't end up turning against itself? Or are we doomed to always produce results quite other than those intended? One thing is certain, however, the way we frame the debate about culture today obscures more than it clarifies. In his book, A Left for Itself, David Swift notes that the Labour Party left in Britain is culturally cut off from working people, and he notes that everyone from Laurie Penny to George Monbiot has a tendency to sneer at the working class and their consumer culture. However, what appears like conformity amongst elite leftists is really a mirage. The reality is that nobody, not Laurie Penny, not Jeremy Corbyn, not Bernie Sanders, and certainly not Donald Trump, has quite worked out who we want to be, or to put it differently, how we might be both in ourselves and for ourselves. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.